36 children boarded New York's Orphan Train in 1872. It reached its destination, completely empty. The story began in the frozen heart of New York City, where the winter of 1872 turned every alley into a graveyard for the forgotten. Snow crusted over the crooked rooftops of 5 Points, and the wind tore through the streets like a living thing, howling and hungry. Barefoot children shuffled through slush, blackened by soot, their thin rags clinging to skin that had gone grey from hunger and cold. By morning, tiny shapes curled in doorways became stiff and still, and no one paused to mourn them. The city's solution was the Orphan Train, a program dressed in charity, sold as salvation. Newspaper columns praised it as an act of mercy. The city's abandoned children would be sent westward to new families, new lives, and clean air far from the choking streets. For the children, it was not a promise, but a sentence, another journey they had no choice in. Many were pulled from overcrowded orphanages that smelled of rot and sickness. Others were collected straight from alleys and tenements, bundled into carriages before the frost could claim them. The train waited at the depot in the pre-dawn mist, a hulking black engine hissing clouds of steam. Lanterns cast weak circles of light on the frozen platform as officials in heavy coats lined the shivering children up one by one. A few clutched small bundles, a chipped toy, or a scrap of cloth. Some had paper tags tied to their coats with names. Others bore only numbers, like cattle waiting to be claimed. There were no hymns sung, no gentle words offered, only the soft crunch of boots on snow and the impatient exhale of the engine. When the sun began to break over the jagged rooftops, the Orphan Train lurched forward with a groan. Wheels screeched against the icy rails, and the children vanished into the rolling fog. In minutes, the city had erased them. No one on that platform could have imagined that the 36 children would never arrive, and that the train they boarded would become a ghost story the city refused to tell. The Orphan Train rumbled northward, cutting through the frozen city like a black arrow. Steam trailed behind it, dissolving into the morning fog that clung to the East River. Inside the cars, the children sat in rigid silence. Their breath clouded the air, forming ghostly shapes that lingered for seconds before fading. The rhythm of the wheels against the tracks was the only sound, a cold, metallic heartbeat carrying them farther from the streets they had known and into the unknown. For the first hour, the cityscape drifted away, brick and smoke giving way to barren fields and snow-choked woods. Some of the children pressed their faces to the icy glass, leaving faint ovals of warmth that quickly froze again. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the wilderness sliding past. They had been promised homes, families who would feed them, clothe them, and maybe, just maybe, call them their own. But the stillness in the car said none of them believed it. They had already learned that promises from adults often hid darker truths. The train's interior was bleak, wooden benches, iron stoves that gave off more smoke than heat, and the faint smell of damp wool and coal dust. The chaperones, 3 stern men in long coats, rarely spoke. They moved down the aisles occasionally, checking the paper tags on coats, adjusting the stove, and then retreating into their own silence. One child, barely 5, clutched a wooden horse in trembling fingers. Another stared at the floor, rocking gently with the rhythm of the rails, as if already surrendering to whatever waited at the end of this journey. As daylight crept higher, the train pushed deeper into the countryside. Snowdrifts walled the tracks, and skeletal trees lined the horizon like silent witnesses. In the small towns they passed, no one waved, and no station master came to greet them. Steam rolled across deserted platforms, hissing against the frost, and the black engine thundered onward without pause. By nightfall, the countryside seemed to swallow the train whole. Stars were swallowed by clouds, and the world outside became a white void, broken only by the whistle's mournful cry. For the 36 children inside, this was the last light they would ever see from a world that had already forgotten them. As the night deepened, the Orphan Train became a moving shadow, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the New York countryside. Its black cars rattled and groaned against the rails, the sound echoing through the frozen wilderness like a heartbeat no one could hear. Inside, the air was stifling with smoke from the iron stoves, yet the children still shivered. The warmth could not touch the cold that lived in their bones. Each child was a story no one wanted to remember. Some had been abandoned in the alleys of 5 Points before they could speak. Others came from tenements where disease claimed parents faster than rent collectors could knock. There was a boy with a jagged scar across his cheek, left behind by the gang he had tried to follow. A girl with tangled hair clutched a scrap of blue ribbon she had pulled from her mother's coffin. Their histories were etched in the way they sat, small shoulders hunched, eyes never meeting one another's. They were already fading from the world before the train even took them. Hours passed, without a single sign of life outside. The landscape became a blur of skeletal trees and white fields, the occasional flicker of a frozen river reflecting the dim lantern light from the windows. One of the older boys noticed that the train hadn't slowed for any station since leaving the city. No one boarded, no one disembarked. The countryside felt endless, and with each mile, it seemed to pull them further from anything human. The 3 chaperones remained statues at opposite ends of the cars. They checked their pocket watches, whispered to one another, and sometimes glanced toward the children with an expression that was neither kindness nor concern. In the dim light, their faces seemed carved from stone. Near midnight, a thick fog rolled in across the tracks. It pressed against the windows like a living thing, blinding the children to the outside world. For a brief moment, the train might as well have been floating in nothingness. And in that suffocating dark, a dreadful thought crept into the minds of the older ones. There might be no one waiting for them at the end of this journey. The Orphan Train pressed on through the night, its iron wheels clanging like a slow, relentless tolling bell. By now, the world beyond its windows had dissolved into darkness and fog, a featureless void broken only by the faint flicker of the locomotive's lantern. To the 36 children inside, the train felt like a coffin on rails, sealed and moving steadily towards something they could not see. Snow began to fall again, heavy and unbroken, swirling into the black sky and smothering the tracks behind them. The countryside, already sparse, disappeared entirely. No lights from farmhouses, no station lamps. Only the endless hiss of steam and the mournful wail of the whistle, carrying into emptiness. Inside the car, the older children exchanged quiet, fearful glances, while the younger ones dozed against the hard wooden benches, their tiny breaths forming ghostly wisps in the lantern light. Hours passed, and still no station appeared. No towns, no other trains. The only signs of life were the 3 chaperones, whose silent watch had begun to feel oppressive. One stood at the end of the car, his face half buried in shadow, eyes fixed on the children with a stillness that chilled them more than the cold air. Occasionally he glanced out the window as though expecting something, or dreading it. A jolt suddenly rippled through the train. Metal screeched, and the cars shuddered violently as if striking something buried beneath the snow. The children stirred, some crying out, the sound sharp again, into the hum of the engine. Then, just as abruptly, the motion smoothed again, the rhythm resuming as though nothing had happened. Yet the air inside the car felt heavier, tighter, as if the walls were closing in. Minutes later, a strange sound drifted through the train. It was faint at first, almost mistaken for the whistle, but too low, too uneven. It came from somewhere along the rails ahead, a moaning echo that rose and fell with the wind, like a voice calling from deep inside the fog. The older children stiffened. Even the chaperones seemed to pause, their eyes flicking toward the dark windows. And still, the train never slowed. It pushed forward into the endless winter night, vanishing deeper into a world where no one was waiting. By the second night, the Orphan Train had become a ghost on the rails. Officially, it should have been logged at multiple depots along its route. Albany, then Utica, then Syracuse. But no telegraph operator reported its passing. No station lamps lit its path. The black locomotive seemed to have vanished into the frozen countryside, leaving behind only the echo of its whistle swallowed by the wind. Back in New York, the city still believed in the illusion of mercy. Newspapers printed short, hopeful lines. 36 orphans depart for new homes upstate. A brighter future awaits them. But as the days passed with no confirmation of their arrival, unease began to grow in whispers. Charity officials claimed the train had likely been delayed by heavy snow. A clerk insisted that messages were slow in winter, that everything was fine. Yet beneath the polite excuses, an unspoken fear began to settle. No one could say exactly where the orphan train was. Inside the cars, the children could feel that isolation closing around them like a fist. Days and nights blurred together in a haze of snow and smoke. The lanterns flickered with each sway of the train, casting long shadows that crawled over the walls. No meals were served, only occasional crusts of bread passed out by the chaperones. The older children tried to mark time by the passing landscape, but soon there was nothing to mark. No towns, no fences, not even the smoke of distant chimneys. Only endless snow and skeletal trees, black against white, fading into the fog. Then, without warning, the train slowed for the first time since leaving the city. A hiss of steam rose around the windows, and the cars shuddered to a near stop in the middle of nowhere. The children leaned toward the glass, their breath fogging the cold panes, searching for any sign of life outside. But there was nothing. No platform, no station, not even a lantern swinging in the dark. Just a flat, white field stretching to a tree line that looked like jagged teeth against the sky. The train lingered in that silence for only a minute, before lurching forward again, as if reconsidering a thought it didn't want to finish. But in that brief pause, a sense of dread settled over the children, a feeling that the world they had left was now impossibly far behind, and the world ahead might not exist at all. Back in New York, the city that had so proudly sent its orphans away began to feel the weight of silence. The orphan train was supposed to have reached Albany within a day, Syracuse within 2. By the 4th day, no telegraph reported its arrival. Station masters along the line were questioned, but their logs showed nothing. No train matching that description had passed. It was as if the black locomotive and its 36 children had rolled into the snow and simply dissolved. The charitable society that sponsored the trip insisted everything was fine. A woman from the office on Broadway reassured reporters that the train was surely delayed by storms and that all the children were in good hands. She refused to release the names of the chaperones. She would not say which town was supposed to receive the orphans. When pressed further, the office locked its doors, and the next day, its windows were dark. Families who had surrendered children to the program began to grow restless. A few mothers who had been promised letters sent to confirm safe arrivals returned to the office, only to find it closed. They went to the police, but the police shrugged. Orphans were the responsibility of the charities, and besides, in the bitter calculus of the city, 36 missing children were hardly unusual. Poverty had a way of erasing the small and the weak. Still, whispers crept along the streets and through the tenements. A man who worked near the rail yard swore he saw the orphan train leave before dawn, steam billowing like a ghost through the fog. He said it moved too fast, too early, like it wasn't part of any schedule he knew. A dock worker claimed he saw children boarding with numbered tags instead of names, like cattle marked for auction. And in taverns along the East River, the rumor began to take root. The train had not gone to any town. It had gone somewhere else, somewhere no one wanted to name. By the end of the first week, the city was already turning away. The story was too small, too easy to bury under the daily miseries of winter. But for the families who had given their children to the black train, the silence was unbearable. And in that silence, dread began to grow, a dread that whatever had taken those children was not the snow and not the night, but something far more deliberate. Far from the city, along the snowbound tracks that cut through empty fields and skeletal woods, whispers began to stir. Farmers and railway workers started sharing strange stories in hushed tones, sightings that could not be explained. One man in a small hamlet north of Albany swore he heard the distant whistle of a train long past midnight. He stepped outside, lantern in hand, and watched as a black locomotive emerged from the fog. Its windows glowed faintly, and for a heartbeat He thought he saw pale faces pressed to the glass. But the train did not slow, did not acknowledge the tiny station. It rolled into the white darkness and vanished as silently as it had arrived. A week later, a hunter trudging through deep snow near the Mohawk River claimed he came upon an abandoned train car sitting on a rarely used siding. Its windows were fogged from the inside, and handprints, small, desperate handprints, smeared the glass. When he approached, the car was empty. No children, no chaperones, no footprints in the snow to suggest anyone had stepped out. By the time he returned with another man to show him, the car was gone. Tales like these trickled along the rural rail lines, growing darker with each telling. Some said the train had broken away from the main track and vanished into the forest, swallowed by a ravine or buried under snow. Others whispered that it had been diverted deliberately, taken to a siding where the children were claimed by men who left no names and no ledgers. There was even a rumor that one engineer had seen the orphan train barreling toward him on a parallel track, yet it made no sound and left no steam behind. When he blinked, it was gone, like a shadow passing over the snow. Back in the villages, people began avoiding the rails at night. Children were warned not to stray too close to the frozen tracks, where echoes of a phantom whistle seemed to ride the wind. And slowly, the missing train became more than a problem to be solved. It became a story of a black engine carrying the unwanted into the cold, a train that never stopped, and 36 children whose eyes were said to still stare out from the frost-covered glass. It took nearly 2 weeks for the city to authorize an investigation into the missing orphan train. By then, the story had already faded from the front pages, buried under headlines of fires, labor strikes, and winter deaths. But whispers had reached the wrong ears. Railwaymen speaking of ghost trains, and hunters swearing they'd seen abandoned cars. The public began to murmur, and murmurs had to be silenced. 2 railway inspectors were dispatched north with a small team following the route the train was meant to take. They traveled by handcar and horseback, moving through wind-blown fields and forests where the tracks seemed to disappear beneath drifts of ice. At every scheduled station, they checked the logs. Each told the same story. No orphan train had passed through, not in daylight, not in darkness. The gaps in the records were like blank pages, as if the train had simply ceased to exist after leaving New York. The investigators searched sidings, abandoned switch yards, and snow-choked cuttings along the line. They found traces of other trains, soot-stained ice, footprints of workmen, and the occasional broken lantern, but nothing that hinted at 36 missing children or their chaperones. In one frozen ravine, the team came across a lone leather shoe, child-sized, lying half-buried in snow. Its edges were stiff and curled from frost, and there were no footprints around it. One man pocketed the shoe without a word. By the end of the 3rd day, the investigators reached a lonely stretch of track cutting through pine forest. Locals had reported strange lights here, faint glows moving silently along the rails. But the men found only emptiness. They camped near the line that night, their fire snapping in the wind. Sometime after midnight, one inspector swore he heard the distant echo of a whistle, long and low, followed by the faintest rumble of wheels. But when the men hurried to the track with their lanterns, nothing appeared. Only the wind hissed through the pines, carrying the sound away. The official report filed in New York the following week was as thin as paper and just as fragile. It stated only that no evidence of the orphan train was found, and the route was considered clear. No follow-up search was scheduled, and so, with the stroke of a pen, the disappearance of 36 children slipped quietly into the city's growing list of unsolved ghosts. Long after the investigation quietly ended, the only tangible evidence that the children had ever existed surfaced in a dusty office on Broadway. It was a ledger, thin, cracked, and water-stained, kept by the charitable society that organized the orphan train's departure. The book was barely more than a list, yet it carried the weight of 36 lost lives. On its brittle pages, most of the entries were nothing more than numbers. Child number 11, male, age 7. Child number 24, female, age 4. A handful had first names written in faint pencil: Emma, Jacob, Nellie. But no last names, as if they were only half-formed identities, already dissolving into anonymity. A few children had no recorded name at all, only a blank line and the word unknown. The page for their supposed destinations was left empty. When the investigators examined the ledger, one detail sent a chill through the room. The departure column was stamped and signed. The return column, meant for confirmation from the receiving town, was blank for all 36 entries. No one had acknowledged their arrival. The pages after the orphan listings were torn out, leaving a ragged edge where records of the chaperones, routes, or additional instructions should have been. Rumours swirled among the few who saw the ledger. One clerk whispered that the missing pages had been removed deliberately, perhaps to protect someone or to erase the trail entirely. Another swore he saw faint reddish smudges on the corner of the paper, like fingerprints stained with rust or dried blood. No one dared ask too many questions. In New York, curiosity about missing orphans was a dangerous hobby. The ledger was locked away for years, shuffled from office to office as the charitable society quietly dissolved. Each new custodian seemed eager to forget it existed. By the time historians would rediscover its faded pages decades later, the book had become more ghost than record. A fragile list of children who had been born, abandoned, numbered, and erased. In the end, the ledger did nothing to bring answers. It was a reminder, not a revelation. Proof that the 36 children had once lived in the shadows of New York, and proof that the city had signed their lives away into the winter night, never to see them return. As winter stretched on, the countryside along the old rail lines began to hum with uneasy stories. Villagers and farmers claimed that on certain nights, when the wind cut through the bare trees like knives, they could hear the wail of a train whistle far out on the frozen horizon. But no train ever appeared on the timetable, and no lantern lights came around the bend. It was as if the sound belonged to a ghost, calling from the snow. The stories began quietly, passed from neighbor to neighbor. A woman in a farmhouse near Schuyler Lake claimed she awoke to the sound of a train clattering past her property long after midnight. She swore she saw small, pale faces staring from the windows as it roared silently by, their breath frosting the glass. Yet when her husband checked the tracks the next morning, there were no fresh marks in the snow, as if nothing had passed at all. A railroad worker in a nearby town told of a different encounter. He was walking the tracks before dawn when he saw a faint glow ahead, a soft orange flicker like the lanterns of a slow-moving train. He stepped aside to wait, expecting the usual thunder of steel and steam. But the light glided past him without sound. For just a moment, he thought he saw children's hands pressed against the windows of a black car, their faces blurred by condensation. Then the glow vanished into the trees, leaving him in darkness and silence so complete that his own heartbeat startled him. Tales like these spread quickly, transforming a simple disappearance into something far more sinister. Locals began referring to it in whispers as the orphan train that never stops. Hunters and trappers swore they would not camp near the tracks, fearing they might wake to the sound of children's cries echoing from the fog. Children in nearby villages were warned to stay clear of the rails at night, lest the ghost train try to carry them away. The official reports dismissed these sightings as superstition, fueled by gossip and winter nerves. But in the long frozen nights, when the wind carried that distant mournful whistle, the people who lived along the line knew better. They swore that the lost children were still riding the rails, searching for a home they would never reach. The first tangible clue appeared miles north of Utica, along a forgotten siding cut through the forest. It was a stretch of track that led nowhere, a dead end used only to store derelict cars and rusting equipment. A pair of lumbermen, returning from a winter camp, claimed they saw a single black train car sitting at the far end of the siding. Its windows were fogged from the inside, and frost clung to the metal like white veins. Curiosity drew them closer. The snow around the siding was untouched, not a single footprint leading to or from the car. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. When the men reached the car, they saw something that froze them in place. Small handprints smeared across the inside of the windows, some clear, some overlapping, as if dozens of little hands had pressed there in desperation. The door was closed tight. One man swore he heard the faintest sound from inside, like a whimper or the distant hum of a lullaby. But when they tried the handle, it was locked. The lumbermen hurried back to town to report what they had seen, but when a small search party returned the next morning, the siding was empty. The black car had vanished. No drag marks, no disruption in the snow, nothing to show how several tons of steel had moved silently through the night. Only the handprints remained in their memory, a vision they would repeat in hushed tones for the rest of their lives. News of the sighting spread among the rural towns like smoke. Some believed the car was abandoned and then stolen for scrap, a simple matter if mischief. Others whispered that the train was not of this world, that the children who vanished were now forever trapped between the living and the dead. Railroad men began to refuse assignments along the old route after dark, claiming the siding itself was cursed. From that moment, the missing orphan train was no longer just a rumor. It had left a mark: frosted glass, silent snow, and the invisible weight of 36 small souls pressing against the windows, pleading for a rescue that would never come. After the sighting at the dead-end siding, the orphan train no longer felt like a lost locomotive. It felt like a curse riding the rails. Word spread through villages and along telegraph lines that a black train sometimes appeared in the night, moving without steam or sound, and then vanished before it could be reached. Farmers whispered about it in their kitchens, and rail workers shared their stories in hushed tones, careful not to speak too loudly, as if the train itself might be listening. One brakeman told a chilling story that made its way down the line. He was working a night shift when he saw a train rolling along the parallel track. No scheduled trains were due. Its windows glowed faintly orange in the distance, and as it drew nearer, he swore he could see the silhouettes of small heads and hands pressed to the glass. He raised his lantern to signal, but the engine made no sound. No whistle. No clatter of wheels. It glided past him in silence, and when he looked back, it had disappeared into the fog, as if it had never been there. Another tale came from a signalman stationed near a rural crossing. He awoke one night to the sound of a train rushing past, shaking the walls of his small hut. But when he stepped outside with his lantern, the tracks were empty and unmarked. The snow remained pristine. Only the faint echo of a whistle lingered in the air, fading like a dying breath. By spring, the legend had fully taken hold. Locals began to call it the orphan train that never stops. Parents used it to frighten children into staying home at night. If you wander too close to the tracks, the black train will take you too. Even hardened railway men avoided night shifts on that stretch of line. Some claimed the train carried a smell, cold iron and damp wool mixed with something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. Others said if you listened closely, you could hear the soft cries of children trailing behind it, blending with the wind. The missing orphan train had become more than a mystery. It had become a moving ghost, a rolling monument to 36 small lives erased, forever circling the cold, endless rails in search of a home they would never find. The winter of 1872 was relentless, as if nature itself conspired to hide the fate of the lost children. Snow fell in waves that buried entire fence lines, choked rivers to stillness, and sealed the countryside beneath a white shroud. Any clue to the orphan train's passage, footprints, tracks, or discarded belongings, vanished under layer after layer of ice. By February, the land no longer looked like a place where humans had ever walked. It was a clean, frozen graveyard, indifferent to the small lives it had swallowed. Railway men sent north to investigate complained that the blizzards erased their work as fast as they could search. One day they would uncover a faint depression where a train car might have sat. By the next morning, drifting snow would level it, leaving behind a blank, endless plain. The forests were no kinder. Pine branches sagged under the weight of ice, snapping and crashing into the silence like gunshots. Even animal tracks were rare, as if the wildlife knew to avoid the cursed route entirely. In the thaw of early spring, a few fragments emerged from the melting snow. A single mitten, so small it could only belong to a toddler. A wooden toy horse, its paint peeled and cracked, lodged in a roadside ditch. And, Most chilling of all, a tiny set of footprints that began near the tracks, wandered in erratic circles, and then stopped abruptly in the middle of an open field, as if the child had simply vanished into the wind. Searchers followed the trail in every direction, but found no sign of life, no body, not even a scrap of cloth. The snow became the perfect accomplice to the mystery. It sealed the truth beneath its frozen layers, protecting the silence that had settled over the missing train. By the time the ice fully receded, the countryside offered no answers. It was as if 36 children and their black train had never existed. Locals who had once sworn they saw the Orphan Train glide silently through the fog began to speak of the snow itself with dread. They said the land had taken the children, claimed them, and would never give them back. And in that bitter, endless winter, the world moved on, leaving the white fields to guard the secret of the train that had disappeared into nothingness. As the weeks passed with no discovery, the whispers in rural taverns and city alleys began to change. At first, people spoke of the Orphan Train as a tragedy of nature, lost to blizzards, swallowed by the winter. But slowly, the tone of the stories shifted. Too many details refused to settle into simple misfortune. Too many questions had no natural answers. And the most unsettling question of all began to rise like a splinter in the city's conscience. What if the children hadn't just disappeared? What if someone had taken them? Rumors spread of buyers who had trailed the orphan trains before, men who arrived in small horse-drawn wagons at distant stations, inspecting children like livestock. Some were farmers looking for cheap labor, others for domestic help. But darker whispers followed the 1872 train. Some said these men were not farmers at all. They wore long coats and wide-brimmed hats, spoke little, and traveled in pairs. They did not linger in towns or introduce themselves to station masters. And when the train failed to arrive at any known station, people began to connect the dots in hushed, fearful conversations. One story told of a telegraph operator in a remote post who claimed he saw a Belasi train stop on a siding at dusk. He said men loaded the children into covered wagons under the pale light of the lanterns. When asked where they were headed, one man replied only, "West." By morning, both the train and the wagons were gone. That operator left town 2 weeks later and was never heard from again. Speculation grew darker still. In a city where poverty and desperation ran rampant, some whispered of criminal rings that profited from children in ways polite society refused to acknowledge. Others leaned toward superstition, claiming the children had been delivered to a sect or secret society that required offerings no church would sanction. Nothing could be proven, but the absence of evidence only fanned the legend's fire. By the time spring arrived, people no longer said the children were lost. They said the children had been taken. And that single word carried a shadow that would stretch for generations, because if human hands had guided the orphan train into the fog, then those hands still lived among them, and they had stolen 36 children without leaving a single trace. By the time spring thawed the snow along the East River, New York had already moved on. The city had little room in its memory for the weak, the poor, or the missing. Fires swept through the tenements, labor riots flared in the streets, and new orphans were born into the cold shadow of the alleys. 36 vanished children were simply another quiet failure in a city built to consume lives and forget them. The newspapers that had once celebrated the Orphan Train program printed no follow-up articles. Editors preferred stories of progress and industry to tales of shame. When curious readers asked if the orphans had reached their new homes, the answer was always vague. The children are well and have been placed. No names were listed. No towns were mentioned. Eventually the questions stopped coming, and the story was allowed to wither in the dark. Charity officials dissolved their offices one by one. Desks were cleared, ledgers disappeared, and the last of the clerks slipped quietly into other work. It was as if the orphan train had been a fever dream the city wanted to wake from, a memory scrubbed clean by willful neglect. Even the families who had surrendered children to the program were urged to stop asking questions. They were told the records were misplaced, or that inquiries only risked disturbing the children's new lives. Behind those polite lies, silence became the city's chosen defense. Yet the countryside would not forget so easily. Along the rural tracks, people still claimed to hear the lonely whistle at night, carrying on the wind like a voice calling from the other side of life. Farmers refused to work fields near certain stretches of the rail line, saying the snow there always seemed to settle in the shape of small footprints. Children in nearby villages whispered about the ghost train, daring one another to sneak near the tracks after dark and see if they could hear the cries of the orphans. In New York, the Orphan Train became a closed chapter, deliberately erased. But out in the frozen fields and hollow woods, the land remembered. It held the story in its quiet, patient way, waiting for the day when someone would finally admit that 36 children had been taken, and that the city had chosen to forget them. While the city turned its gaze elsewhere, a handful of families refused to let the Orphan Train disappear into silence. They were not wealthy families, nor powerful, but the bonds of blood and memory drove them to keep searching long after everyone else had given up. A sister who had kissed her little brother goodbye at the depot returned every week to the closed charity office, pounding on the locked doors until her fists were raw. A grandmother who had surrendered her orphaned grandson after losing her home walked the streets with a faded daguerreotype, showing his face to anyone who would look. No one had answers. Letters began to pour into rural towns along the train's intended route. Farmers, station masters, and even parish priests received desperate inquiries scrawled in shaky handwriting. Have you seen a boy? Age 8? Brown hair. Thin. Answers to the name Jacob. Some letters described only a blanket or a toy. All the families had left to identify their missing. Most were never answered. A few came back with curt replies. No such train passed through. We have no orphans. The words were cold and final, as if the world had decided that asking was more shameful than losing. Some families took the search into their own hands. They walked the frozen countryside, following the rail line through fields and forest, calling names into the wind. They traced rumors to dead ends, abandoned sidings, empty snowbanks, and stretches of track where even the birds seemed silent. One grieving mother swore she heard a faint tapping on a train car as she passed a deserted junction at dusk, but when she ran to the siding, there was nothing. The grief of these families became part of the legend itself. Their endless searching, their whispered prayers in church pews, their trembling hands clutching crumpled letters, all fed into the story of the 36 orphans who vanished into the winter night. In time, neighbors began to avoid them. People looked away when they appeared in the market or on the street. To keep asking was to remind everyone that the city had failed, that the land itself seemed to have swallowed children whole. And yet, in their hearts, these families knew the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Children do not simply vanish. Someone, somewhere, knew what had happened on that black train. By the following winter, the Orphan Train's disappearance had transformed from a grim memory into something far more unsettling. Stories began to multiply, told by farmers, rail workers and trav, Ellis moving through the snow-choked countryside. They all spoke of the same thing, a train that should not exist, appearing and vanishing as though the rails themselves remembered the lost children. The first confirmed sighting came from a shepherd returning home at dusk near the small town of Vernon. He swore he heard the low, rhythmic rumble of a train long before he saw anything on the horizon. Then, through the drifting snow, a black locomotive emerged, lanterns glowing dimly in the fog. As it passed, he caught sight of the windows, fogged from the inside, marked with the faint shapes of tiny hands. Behind the glass were pale, expressionless faces, pressed close, staring out at a world that could no longer touch them. When he ran toward the crossing to see where the train was headed, it was gone. No sound. No tracks in the snow. Other sightings soon followed. A group of hunters camped near a frozen stretch of the Mohawk River reported seeing a faint orange glow through the trees at night. They heard the clatter of wheels and the hiss of steam, but when they approached the tracks, they found only darkness and a cold wind that smelled faintly of coal and wet wool. A railroad night watchman claimed he saw the train glide past his signal post without making a sound, and when he peered into the cars, he saw rows of empty benches, except for one child, seated alone, staring straight at him, before fading into the lantern light. These accounts were whispered in taverns and around hearths, growing more elaborate with each telling. The train was said to appear only in the dead of winter, always after dark, and always on the same lonely stretches of track where the real Orphan Train had vanished. Some swore that if you listened closely, you could hear the muffled sobs of children riding the rails, condemned to an endless journey they would never escape. By the time spring came again, the story of the phantom Orphan Train was no longer a local rumor. It was a legend, one that carried the weight of grief, guilt, and the unmistakable chill of something that refused to rest. As the legend of the Orphan Train deepened, new details began to creep into the whispers. It wasn't just the children who haunted the rails anymore. Travelers began to speak of a figure, a silent, faceless conductor who seemed to guide the phantom train through the night. No one knew his name, and no surviving record from the original journey ever listed the men assigned to escort the children. It was as though the chaperones, like the orphans, had been erased. The first mention came from a night watchman near Rome, New York. He had taken shelter in his small trackside cabin during a blizzard when he heard the distant wail of a train whistle. He rushed to the door and saw a faint orange glow moving slowly along the rails. Lantern in hand, he stepped closer and watched the black locomotive glide by in near silence. Through the front window of the engine, he swore he saw a man in a dark coat and cap staring straight ahead. His face was pale, almost featureless in the lantern light. The watchman lifted his lamp to signal, but the man did not respond, did not even blink. A moment later, the train dissolved into the snow as though it had never been there. Other stories followed. A postal rider crossing a lonely stretch at dusk claimed, "He saw a figure standing on the rear platform of the last car, a man in a long coat, hat pulled low, his hands gloved and still. The rider called out, but the man never turned, never moved, as the car vanished around a bend that led to nothing but empty forest." Some said the chaperone had been cursed to ride the train forever, responsible for the children he failed to protect. Others whispered he was never human at all, but a shadow of whatever force had claimed the orphans in the first place. These tales only fueled the fear surrounding the lost train. For the families still mourning, the faceless conductor became a symbol of betrayal, a final silent witness who carried 36 children into the void and never looked back. And in the villages along the rails, people swore that if you caught his eye even just once, your nights would be filled with the sound of the train's whistle and the muffled sobs of children riding into eternity. North of Utica, the rail line cut through a stretch of forest so thick and silent that even the wind seemed hesitant to pass through. It was here, locals whispered, that the Orphan Train had vanished for good. Hunters and trappers who roamed those woods in the winters after 1872 began to share stories, low, uneasy recollections of strange encounters that clung to them like the cold. One hunter claimed he was following deer tracks along a frozen creek when he heard the low hum of a train in the distance. It was a sound that didn't belong. The rails in that area had been abandoned for weeks due to snowdrifts. He crouched behind a tree, peering through the branches. Slowly, impossibly, a black locomotive slid across the horizon, its windows aglow with faint orange light. He swore he could see small hands pressed against the glass, smeared as if the children inside were trying to escape. And then, as silently as it appeared, the train dissolved into the fog curling between the pines. When he approached the tracks, there were no fresh prints in the snow, no marks of wheels, only his own. Another tale came from a trapper who found something more tangible. Deep in the woods, not far from a sharp bend in the line, he discovered a broken toy lying in the snow, a tiny wooden horse, its head snapped off. It was half frozen into the ice, as if it had been there for weeks. He took it back to town, only to be met with uneasy stares and murmurs that he had brought back a piece of the cursed train. He left it on his porch that night, and by morning the toy was gone. Locals began to avoid the forest entirely after dusk. They said the trees themselves seemed to whisper when the snow fell heavily, carrying the faint echoes of a train whistle. Some swore that if you followed the sound, you'd see lantern light weaving between the trees, guiding you toward a track that wasn't really there. And anyone foolish enough to follow might not return. By the third winter, the forest beyond Utica had earned a reputation that outlived the headlines. It became a place where hunters walked quickly, children never played, and everyone agreed that if you heard a train in those woods, you should never go looking for it. By the time a third winter settled over the rails, the missing Orphan Train was no longer just a ghost story. It had become a curse. Those who claimed to see it, or even to hear its phantom whistle, often found misfortune stalking them soon after. Farmers whispered of livestock falling ill, hunters lost in sudden storms, and families struck by fevers that came without warning. In the villages along the line, people began to believe that the train was not merely a remnant of tragedy, but a moving omen of death. One story spread quickly through the countryside, whispered over tavern counters and beside hearths. A young man named Elias, skeptical of all the rumors, went into the forest near the old siding one night, determined to prove the legend false. He carried a lantern and a hunting rifle, following the tracks deep into the woods. Hours later, he returned pale and trembling, unable to speak. By morning, he had developed a high fever and began raving about hearing children crying in the wind. He died within 3 days, and his family swore they heard a train whistle echoing through the hills the night he passed. Another tale came from a railway inspector assigned to survey the abandoned stretch. He reportedly carried the small leather shoe he found in the snow back to his home in Albany. That night, his wife heard the distant sound of wheels on the floorboards, as though tiny feet were pacing their bedroom. Within a week, the man was found dead in his chair, his face twisted in terror. The shoe was missing. These stories only fed the belief that the orphan train demanded to be left alone. People said the land had claimed the children, and any attempt to disturb their eternal journey would invite the same fate. Families along the line began leaving offerings, small toys, candles or bits of bread, near the tracks during the coldest months, hoping to appease the restless souls. Some even placed lanterns in their windows on certain nights, so the phantom train might pass by without stopping. The legend had fully matured into a warning. If the black train appeared to you, do not follow, do not touch, and do not speak of it to the wrong ears. Those 36 lost children were not simply gone. They were still riding, and they would drag misfortune behind them like a shadow. As the years passed, the orphan train's disappearance etched itself into the landscape, leaving behind signs that locals swore were messages from the lost children. In the dead of winter, when the wind howled through the pines and the snow turned glassy under the moon, strange marks would appear along the old rail line. Farmers and hunters found small footprints in the frost, wandering alongside the tracks before stopping abruptly, as if the children had stepped off the world itself. The windows of abandoned cars sometimes carried ghostly stains that no one could explain. On one forgotten siding near the Mohawk River, a rusting passenger car became infamous. Every January, when the frost bloomed across its cracked windows, the same shapes appeared. Small, overlapping handprints, some clear and some blurred, as if they were pressed in a panic and smeared downward. A local boy swore he saw his own reflection staring back at him in that glass, only to notice a second, smaller face beside his own, pale and hollow-eyed, that vanished when he blinked. Railway workers who maintained the line in later years reported other, subtler signs. Lanterns that flickered in the distance on moonless nights, moving in a slow rhythm like a passing train, only to disappear before they reached the next bend. Thin trails of smoke rising from the trees, though no engine had passed in decades. And on the coldest nights, when the wind carried just right, a sound would rise from the rails, a long, low whistle, followed by what some swore were muffled cries. Villagers learned to respect these signs. Children were told never to play near the tracks when frost covered the ground, for fear that the ghostly footprints might lead them away. Some elders claimed that if you followed the footprints too far, they would eventually merge with your own, and you would never find your way back. The frost and snow had become more than weather. They were a canvas for the story of 36 orphans who refused to be forgotten. Even those who dismissed the legend admitted a simple, uneasy truth. The land seemed to remember. Each winter, it replayed the tragedy in ice and silence, a reminder that the orphan train was still out there, its small passengers pressing their hands against the world, begging to be seen. By the mid-1870s, the orphan train had become a travelling shadow, a story carried from one generation to the next. Locals swore it appeared only on the blackest winter nights, when no moon touched the snow and the world seemed to hold its breath. Travellers unlucky enough to see it told their stories in whispers, careful not to linger on the details, as though speaking too much of it might call the train back. One of the most chilling accounts came from a peddler travelling between villages on a frigid February night. He had set up camp beside a frozen creek near the tracks, his mule tethered to a tree, when he heard a distant rumble that vibrated through the ice. At first he assumed it was a scheduled freight train, but then the sound grew softer, not louder, as if the noise came from the earth itself. He crept to the edge of the line with his lantern raised. Through the fog, a black locomotive emerged, moving slowly, almost gliding. The light from its front lamp was dim, and its wheels seemed to turn without effort. The peddler froze as the cars passed by. Through each frosted window, he saw them, small, pale faces watching him. Some pressed their hands to the glass, leaving foggy smears that trailed as the car rolled past. Not a sound came from inside. Not a cry, not a whisper. Only the faint hiss of steam that vanished into the night. The last car held the figure that would haunt him forever. A man stood on the rear platform, hat low, coat long and dark, his gloved hands gripping the rail. The peddler swore the man's face was featureless in the lantern glow, smooth and pale like a wax mask. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the train was gone. The night returned to stillness. The mule bolted, and the peddler did not retrieve it until morning. Stories like his became warnings passed from mouth to mouth. Locals said that if the phantom train passed you by and you watched it too closely, your nights would be filled with the sound of muffled sobs and the low moan of a whistle that no one else could hear. Some said the train carried those who stared too long away in their dreams, and they would never wake again. Decades after the orphan train vanished, the story remained a knot of contradictions and missing pieces. Officially, no one in authority ever admitted that 36 children had disappeared. There were records of their departure, but no records of their arrival. The charity that organized the journey left behind almost nothing. Ledgers with torn pages, unsigned reports, and receipts that named no towns, no families. It was as if someone had plucked the children from the world and scrubbed away the evidence with careful, deliberate hands. Historians who studied the case in later years were baffled by the inconsistencies. Some depots swore the train had never passed. Others insisted they heard it, but never saw a car stop. The telegraph stations along the line carried no messages about delays, no confirmations of safe passage. One clerk, decades later, admitted in a private letter that he had been told to stop asking questions, that the matter was closed and better left unspoken. Even the identities of the chaperones blurred into mystery. 3 men had escorted the children, but their names were never made public. When researchers combed through employment logs, they found no records of these men working for the rail company at all. A few suggested they had been hired privately, chosen not for their trustworthiness, but for their willingness to disappear alongside their charge. Every trail led to the same silent wall. No graves were ever found. No reports of runaway orphans surfaced in neighboring towns. And yet, for years, the ghost train sightings continued, like a living memory haunting the rails. Skeptics insisted the legend was born of grief and winter superstition. Believers countered that the very absence of evidence was the answer, that the children had been erased with intent, taken somewhere no one was meant to find. By the end of the 19th century, The story of the Orphan Train had become a riddle the city refused to solve. Each missing detail deepened the unease, and each silence in the records spoke louder than any report could. It was no longer just a mystery of lost children. It was the shadow of a crime that no one would confess, a scar that the official history of New York would spend a century trying to ignore. While official records stayed silent, small towns along the old rail lines carried their own memory of the Orphan Train, memories that no amount of denial could erase. In hamlets like Vernon, Schuyler Lake, and New Lisbon, elders told stories that all began the same way. I saw it once. In Vernon, an aging blacksmith recalled standing by the tracks on a moonless night when he heard the soft rattle of wheels. He expected a scheduled freight train, but what emerged from the fog was a single black locomotive moving at an unnatural crawl. The windows glowed faintly, and he swore he saw rows of small faces peering out, their yes, dull and distant. He lifted his lantern to signal, but the train did not whistle or slow. It rolled past silently, leaving him standing in the cold with his own breath rising like smoke. Further west, in Schuyler Lake, a farmer claimed he saw the train arrive at the edge of the station and then vanish, as if the earth had swallowed it. He described how his horse reared violently, eyes rolling, as the air turned suddenly cold. In the morning, he found the ground around the tracks dusted with snow, except for one detail. Small, barefoot prints frozen into the earth, circling in confusion before stopping in the middle of the platform. New Lisbon carried its own tale. A group of children walking home from a church gathering reported seeing the faint light of a train in the distance. They followed it along the line for half a mile, laughing and running in the dark, until the glow simply faded into the trees. The children returned home pale and trembling, claiming they could still hear the whistle echoing long after the light was gone. Their parents forbade them from ever going near the tracks again. In these towns, the Orphan Train was not a legend born in city newspapers, but a living memory passed from one family to another. People avoided the rails after dark. Doors were locked before sunset in winter, and lanterns were sometimes left burning in windows, as if to guide restless souls past without pause. Even decades later, when the last steam train stopped running, the towns whispered the same warning. The black train still rides, and those who see it are never the same again. By the time the legend of the Orphan Train had settled into the bones of the countryside, the story was no longer just about a missing locomotive. It was about 36 small souls who had been erased. Their absence was heavy, felt in ways that were not always seen. In the fields where the tracks ran silent, farmers swore the air grew colder without warning. The wind seemed to carry a soft, plaintive tone, like the echo of a lullaby sung from somewhere far below the earth. Travelers who walked the line at dusk often described an unshakable feeling of being watched, not by malice, but by sorrow itself. A hunter once told of kneeling to tie his boot near the tracks and hearing the faint shuffle of feet behind him, like children running in play. When he turned, the snow was untouched, and the forest stood still. He left the woods and never returned. Even the land seemed to hold on to the memory. In the spring, when the snow finally melted, patches of the rail bed stayed barren, as if the soil itself refused to grow over the memory of what had passed. Wildflowers bloomed around these spots, but never on them, leaving a pattern that locals began to call the children's path. They said that if you placed a hand there on a quiet evening, you could feel a tremor in the earth, like the pulse of wheels passing far below the world. For the families who had lost children to the Orphan Train, grief became a lifelong shadow. Some moved west to escape the memories, only to hear whispers of the ghost train in other towns, as if the story travelled faster than the rails. Others stayed in New York, clutching faded daguerreotypes, living with the gnawing knowledge that no grave would ever hold their loved ones. The tragedy had left behind no bodies, no answers, only a sorrow that seemed to seep into the ground, the trees, and the winter wind. Those who walked the line at night swore they could hear soft knocking from nowhere, like little hands on glass, pleading to be let back into a world that had forgotten them. By the turn of the century, The story of the Orphan Train had left the realm of recent memory and entered the permanence of folklore. The missing children were no longer just a tragedy. They had become a fixture of the land, as inseparable from the rails as the iron itself. In villages scattered along the line, the ghost train was spoken of with the same hushed respect given to ancient curses. Parents warned their children, "Stay away from the tracks after dark. The black train takes what it wants." Generations of farmers swore that the train followed the same pattern each winter. On the coldest, moonless nights, a faint light would appear along the horizon, followed by a low hum that vibrated in the bones. Lanterns flickered in farmhouses, animals stirred in their stalls, and dogs howled as if something unseen were moving past. Those brave, or foolish, enough to approach the line often returned with haunted eyes, claiming they saw small figures pressed against the frosted glass, leaving trails of breath that faded into the night. Some communities even began to acknowledge the train in ritual. Each January, as the bitter wind swept across the fields, a few families placed offerings near the rails: dolls, pieces of bread, or small wooden toys. They believed that honoring the lost children might keep the ghost train from lingering too long or calling new souls to follow it into the dark. The tradition spread, and by the early 1900s it was common to find tokens half buried in the snow, silent reminders that the story refused to die. Travelers passing through these towns would sometimes catch a glimpse of the strange local habits: lanterns burning in windows, children clutching charms, adults avoiding the tracks as if they hid teeth. When asked why, the villagers would speak the same words year after year: "The train still rides." It was never said in jest. By then, the city of New York had buried the story entirely, its ledgers lost and offices repurposed. But the countryside remembered. The fields, the forests, and the empty rails kept telling the story in whispers of wind and frost. The Orphan Train had crossed the line from history to legend, and once a story reaches that place, it never truly leaves. On the coldest winter nights, when the land holds its breath and the moon hides behind black clouds, the Orphan Train still rides. Farmers lying awake in their lonels by houses hear it first, a low, mournful whistle rolling through the hills like a lament for lives long lost. Then comes the faint glow of lanterns drifting across the abandoned rails and the black shape of a locomotive gliding silently through the fog. Its wheels turn, but they make no sound, as if the train belongs to another world entirely. The children are still there. Through frost-caked windows, their pale faces press against the glass, breath blooming in soft halos before fading into the night. Some eyes are empty, resigned to the endless journey. Others seem to search, desperate, as if hoping that someone, anyone, might see them and remember. Tiny hands leave smudges and streaks on the icy panes, sliding downward in motions that feel more like pleading than waving. At the very end of the train, the faceless conductor stands on the rear platform, his long black coat fluttering in the wind. He does not look toward the living. He only faces forward, eternally bound to the path ahead, guiding his stolen passengers through a journey with no destination. Witnesses say that for a heartbeat, the night feels thicker around him, as though he carries the weight of a secret too heavy for the world to hold. And then, just as suddenly as it appears, the Orphan Train vanishes. The whistle fades into the wind, the lights dissolve into fog, and the forest reclaims its silence. But those who witness it swear that something lingers, a bone-deep chill, and the faintest sound of knuckles tapping on glass, receding into eternity. More than a century has passed since 36 children boarded that black train in 1872. None ever returned. And somewhere, in the endless winter night, they are still riding, waiting, and watching. If you felt the chill of their story tonight, let it stay with you, and follow the shadows where history refuses to look. Subscribe to the Macabre record for Moat. Read dark journeys into the past, where forgotten tragedies still whisper. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next story that history tried to bury, and the next haunting you'll never forget.